We're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled The War of Silent Stars. Alien vet denied treatment. The human vet just whispered, "Easy buddy, HFY sci-fi stories." Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. They told stories in that city with neon bones and glass skin, where the rain made rivers down the faces of monuments and the night hummed with cold power. They told stories of heroes and monsters, of fleets that burned across constellations, and of voices that could steady a heartbeat or stop a war. But the biggest story began small, on a curb that smelled like old rain and hot metal. An alien veteran stood there alone, holding a folded ribbon of medals he could not cash, and a paper slip worth less than the ink that scrawled it. His chest heaved once, twice, like the sea trying to remember how to breathe. The clinic doors were a lens-bright promise beyond him, all white and clean and antiseptic, and the security drone above the door recited the policy for the third time in the same friendly tone. "We regret to inform you, veiled unit, that your species is not covered under the Coalition Care Compact at this location. Proceed to accredited facilities in Quadrant C. Estimated travel, 61 hours. If this is an emergency call," he couldn't call anyone. His voice was a raw ember, every sound hurt. It was what the silence did. It had eaten the war's edges and left veterans like him with wounds the scanners couldn't quantify. Noise became knives. Echoes became ghosts. He pressed one palm to the side of his head and felt the ridges of his bone plate, slick with rain. The metals slipped in his other hand and fell, clinking just once before the storm swallowed it. He bent too quickly and the world slid sideways. He was going down without grace when a shadow was suddenly there, catching him by the elbow. "Easy, buddy," a human voice whispered. It wasn't loud, not a command, not a pitying performance for passers-by. Just a steady, low thread of sound, the kind of word a field medic says without thinking. A ritual that reconnects broken synapses and scattered courage. He looked up into the eyes of the human who'd caught him. A woman. Her hair was rain-slicked back, her jacket old but clean, her jaw set like someone who had been told no by 100 different doors and learned how to make them say yes anyway. Her name tag was plastic and chipped, the letters cheap and stubborn, Hale. Her hand didn't move. She stayed with him through the sway. "Easy, buddy," she said again, softer, as if she was setting the room's temperature with a whisper. He hadn't been called buddy in years. On the front they called him by rank or by species. Veiled, mountain voice, bonehead, names that stripped the person away until only duty remained. Buddy took him back to a barracks heat far from any star, where coffee steamed and someone told a joke even if it wasn't funny, because that was the law. Keep warmth alive where the universe tried to kill it. Through the rain, he saw the drone's optic flash like an indifference, the way doors look at the poor, the way systems look at those who can't speak the right language. "I can help you," Hale added, roughly the living opposite of a scripted notice. "What's your name?" He tried to answer, and it was pain. The syllables were saws. He hissed, and the hiss tore like a thin paper. He tasted copper, but he forced the jagged pieces together. "Keth," he said. "Good," she breathed, as if the first step in fixing a shattered machine is giving it a name. "Okay, Keth. I'm Mara Hale. We're going to breathe through this, on my count in 2, 1. He watched her lips. He watched the rhythm of her shoulders, and he mirrored it because he didn't have a better belief at hand. In, out. The rain slowed, though it didn't. The city softened, though it hadn't changed. The drums of his own body found a steady drummer. Behind them, the clinic door side opened to exhale a cool draft. Some instinct of the building recognized a human with an ID. She stood him up, and they went in. The waiting room was a tube of soft light. There were chairs like white shells and a wall of plants that wasn't real but was expensive. Keth's eyes flicked across it all and landed on the triage desk where a person smiled with their mouth and not their eyes. Their gaze took in his plates, his ridge lines, the way his arms were built to lift stones and hold shields, and they began to recite the policy even before he reached the counter. Mara didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture or float her credentials like a flag. She slid an old card across the counter with her thumb on the chip, so the chip warmed, so the chip rewrote any hesitation the system might have. The triage screen blinked once, twice. The veiled are covered under Section 7, Subline 4, Mara said, calm as law. Coalition recognized their service 3 months ago. You didn't update your scripts. The triage tech frowned. That applies to accredited veterans facilities. This branch is accredited, she returned. 2 weeks ago, your admin's late with the posters. And because the drone overhead was listening, and because sometimes half the war is optics, she added without looking up, and if we're keeping someone in pain out because your servers got the flu, I'll ask the drone to forward a complaint to the oversight minister along with a copy of last year's fines. The drone recalculated its friendliness. The doors knew how to say yes when worse doors were threatened. The tech swallowed and said, right this way. Keth stared at her, at how quietly she moved the wall, at how cleanly she cut the knot. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't magic. It was a human making a system behave. They set him on a cot in a room that smelled like templated lemon. The walls softened to warm and broke into soothing shapes the AI believed were calming. Mara's hands were clean and oddly gentle, though her knuckles were a catalog of old impacts. She eased instruments into his ear and made them sing at a frequency that slid under the pain. Silent sickness, she murmured. Classic, you were near a quietus event. His throat worked. He nodded once. He had been near many. The quietus, not the enemy's name for themselves, not anyone's name at first, were machine choruses born in the dark between stars. They sang with physics, and their song turned the universe down. Sound ceased still inside your bones. Radios coughed blood. Neutrino detectors flatlined. Flares looked like memories of light, not light. The night lost its texture. The first time it happened, a pilot said, the stars went silent. It never stopped being a terror. I was a forward, Keth managed. I held his arm bent toward his memory of a shield. The line. Mara nodded. She had the muscle memory of battlefield triage in the way she worked, fast but not hurried, precise but not mechanical. I was a medic, 3rd Assault Brigade, 2 cycles. We were told you veiled were a wall. He would have laughed if the act didn't feel like someone sanding the inside of his windpipe. We were rocks the sea forgot how to break. He rasped, a piece of an old cadence from a long fire line. Mara's eyes glinted. She taped a thin patch behind his ear that hummed like held breath. This will feel like the ocean at night, she warned. Dark but not scary. A low blanket, it modulates what the silence chewed through. She placed a second patch to mirror it. You'll hear yourself again. He did. It came not as a sudden sunrise, but as a slow pale, like the sky making up its mind. The shriek under his skin softened. The needles became rain. He closed his eyes and let the ache settle into manageable. Mara checked his eyes with a light and then, with a familiarity that didn't presume, asked, "You got anywhere to go when you walk out?" He hesitated. The answer didn't need words. That kind of stillness is a shape everyone knows. "There's a place," she said, "for vets, no flags, no slogans, just a roof and some soup that tastes like it's been alive more than a minute. You can stay there until the patches come off." Her smile was brief and convincing, and until the storm in your head forgets your address. He looked at her hands. He looked at the line of her mouth. He looked at the way the world tilted on its axis toward her and steadied. "Why?" he asked, not bitterly, simply as a survivalist counting the resources of a day. "Because someone once bent over me on a field that named every second a thief," Mara said, "and they whispered, 'Easy, buddy,' and I lived because they made me believe it." She shrugged. "So now I go around making it believable." He didn't thank her. Some words are too small and too big at the same time. But he held her gaze long enough that she knew. The clinic released him to the rain. The clouds had bruised more purple, streetlights burned like lonely suns. They walked together, a human and a veiled, a medic and a forward, two survivors of a war whose silence still howled down alleys and through wires in the night. In the days that followed, the galaxy remembered them, not by their names first, by a video. Someone on the sidewalk had caught a sliver of it, the human catching the alien, the whisper, the hands, the simple fact of the door letting them in after saying no. The clip ran like electricity along the rails of 1,000 networks. Chatter swelled. Some voices said, "This is who we are." Others spat, "This is why we're weak." In the quiet corners that matter, old enemies took notes. Mara ignored the noise. She set Keth up in a cot under a warm vent in a building with honest floors and a kitchen that steamed good. He slept like broken stone for 20 hours. When he woke, the soup tasted like the people who made it cared. There were others there, humans with jackets that hid scars and laughs that admitted they were trying to heal, a pair of Shillith twins who shook when a door closed, a Rabathi tech whose hands twitched for tools even in sleep. Everyone had the silence in their bones somehow. No one asked which side you'd been on when the sky split. The new side was recovery. Keth didn't understand this at first. The war had been a sketch with thick lines. Friend, enemy, fire, shield, a song that kills, a scream that saves. The house where Mara worked blurred those lines. It made a new pattern. 2 days later, the universe knocked. It was not a polite knock. It was a tremor that rolled under the floor like a beast turning. Crockery rattled. The lights hiccuped. Out in the street, the rain paused in the air as if listening. Mara was already on her feet, her body registering what her mind hadn't asked. She pressed 2 fingers to the patch behind Keth's ear and turned its power a fraction up. "What is it?" he said, voice steadier than it had any right to be. "Field," she said, eyes gone far and war sharp. "One of the quietest arrays, close." Then she remembered to make the words human again, not just soldier. She looked at the Shillith twins. "Basement," she told them. "Now we know the drill." The Rabathi tech had already shouldered a bag of tools. The house wasn't armed, not in the way news feeds like to show, but it had the kind of preparation people gather when the world has taught them not to trust endings. The lights flickered again. The universe dimmed, the way a room goes soft when someone says a name that matters. Keth felt it like teeth. "It's not possible," he whispered. "The arrays were dismantled." "Most," Mara said. "Not all. Some fell into hungry hands after pirates, warlords, men who like to hold a knife to the night and watch it sweat." She was already at the window. She watched the horizon the way hunters watch a tree line. There, like a bruise spreading from a cut, came a darkness deeper than the storm. It moved not like weather but like will, and under it the city's sound died. The traffic's buzz went down to a memory. The drones stuttered and fell. The screens in the diner across the street turned to gray and then to nothing. The stars, even the ones you couldn't see through the clouds, grew mute. People panicked because that's what you do when the world goes soft from a knife you can't name. They ran and their feet sounded wrong. They screamed and didn't hear themselves, so they screamed louder until they ran out of breath. Mara watched and reached for the tool she had used the most in war, a map inside her mind. She saw street grids and air currents and the way a field eats waves like a tide. She traced the bruise back to a point. "There," she said, "industrial stacks, old energy plant. They've made a nest out of a clean ruin." Keth found himself on his feet. He didn't ask whether he was coming, the same way a shield knows the wall without being told. The patch behind his ear hummed stronger, taking some of the silence's teeth out of the bite. They ran into the street. They moved through a city that had lost its heartbeat and was remembering it in pieces. Mara's steps were light and fast. Keth's were heavy and sure, 2 different kinds of soldier synced by need. At the second intersection, a man guided by fear and a failing comm network pointed a weapon just because he had one. Keth stopped with a hand up. He did not shout. Shouting was useless in the hush. He made a shape with his body that the man recognized from some deep training or a movie's muscle memory. We're not enemies. The man's eyes were wide, like someone standing at the mouth of a cave where something tradition says doesn't exist. He lowered the weapon and they moved on. When they reached the stacks, the quietest field was thick enough to turn breath into a task. Keth tasted copper again. Mara slowed, eyes on the pattern of descent of a drone that had lost its voice and fallen like a bird with wet wings. He read her face and knew. The array was close, and the men who'd lit it were not the kind who liked to talk after. They moved through the fence line, a gap cut by a previous violence. Inside, the plants smelled like ghosts of power. The turbines were bones. The floor remembered oil. The air was the inside of a mouth that had forgotten how to sing. Mara placed her palm on a rusted console and looked beyond it, beyond the ruined logic to the ways someone might wire a stolen god. She had learned to read other people's cruelty the way a child learns to read books. Below, she said, they found the stairwell that dreamed of being a ladder and took it down. On the third landing, two men waited with nervous hands and loud eyes. Their weapons looked like someone had married scrapyard metal to greed. Keth stepped forward. War had taught him terrible things. How to break a body like it was built to be broken. How to move in a corridor the exact width of violence. He could have done those things. He did not. He made the world's narrow space wider with the simplest tactic the Veiled had taught the Coalition at the worst moment of the war. Stand and take the strike on the shield of your training. He lifted a metal plate he had taken from a turbine's skin like a knight lifts an old memory. The first man shot. The plate sang dull and took the impact. The second man hesitated, long enough for Mara to step in, knock the weapon aside, and make him forget he had a reason to hold it. They left them breathing. They moved deeper into a glow the color of hurt. The array looked like a flower from a godless prayer, a ring of petals wired with stolen cables, a heart that pulsed not with light but with a smothered anti-light, a mathematics that made the air fall slowly like premonition. Keth felt his body try to forget itself. He had stood near dozens of these, and every time they made him a man-shaped memory instead of a man. Mara was reading it with her body the way some people play a piano in a dark room, remembering where the keys are by how sharp they feel. They've tied the suppression harmonics to a scavenged reactor, she said, half to herself, half to the universe. They don't know what they've got, they just like what it does. She licked dry lips. We need to break the link without blowing the plant. Keth nodded. He could lift stones. He could carry weight enough to shame gravity for an hour. He could hold a line so long the sunrise apologized for being late. But he could not do what she was doing. He could only be what that work needed, time. The two men from the stairs had found their breath and their courage. Shouts came up the shaft, short, sharp. Keth shifted his grip on the makeshift shield and took a position in the mouth of the corridor. The first man to come around the bend saw a Veiled forward and made a choice. He fired fast and stupid. The second ducked wide. The third hesitated at the sight of his friend bouncing off a plate and decided he had a family. He ran. Keth stayed. He didn't shout. He didn't smile. He didn't enjoy it. He simply existed like a boulder in a flood. He took a blow on the shield. He moved when the corridor asked him to appear elsewhere. He cracked a weapon against a railing, turned a strike aside, placed a palm on a chest, and said with the weight of a mountain, no. Then he returned to the mouth of the world where Mara was whispering to a terrible flower. It took a long time and no time. The universe turned its head once and looked away. When it looked back, Mara had bled a wire free, wrapped a cable around another like she was teaching snakes a ballet, and found a switch that wasn't a switch but wanted to be. She pressed it like you press a wound that wants to kill you, firm enough to make it change its mind. The array died. Not dramatically. No bursting lights, no thunder. It exhaled like a monster that had clenched too long and finally learned what letting go is. The air remembered sound. The city breathed. Drones sputtered alive across rooftops. Someone somewhere laughed sharp and high like a release valve, and it carried through the stairwell like a wave remembering its shore. Mara sagged and caught herself. Keth looked at her and read a book without words. The work was heavy even if you were strong. The strong needed someone to say it was okay to be tired. The men who had lit the array had a boss. He had waited. He had money and thus believed he had meaning. He stepped into the room with 3 guns that had names and a stance he believed showed how many he had hurt. He looked at Mara and then at Keth and saw not people but obstacles. He raised his hand. Keth measured the distance between that hand and the weapon on it and judged that he was not as fast as the trigger. He did not have to be. He stepped between the line of force and Mara with a motion so simple it felt like something the planet had taught him. He became a wall that had learned how to move. He knew he would take the shot, and he had made peace with it long ago on a different metal floor under a different quiet sky. The shot did not come. It didn't because the boss wasn't ready for the city to remember itself. A drone, rebooting in that exact second, recognized a weapon by its geometry and sent a polite blast of sticky foam at the boss's arm. The gun barked into glue. The boss cursed because he had paid to never be ridiculous and was suddenly ridiculous. 2 more drones arrived with the perfect mimicry of civic order and began to read the fines he would owe for activating a decommissioned weapon of war. Sometimes the universe is absurd enough to save your life. Mara laughed, but softly. The kind of sound that means you've seen death and find it funny that paperwork can sometimes do the same job. They walked back out into the city. Mara let the paramedics, white coats, real plants in their lobby, put a proper patch on Keth's ear and affix a small badge to his file and to his chest that meant the world. Recognized, covered, valued. She listened to the sergeant who had arrived 2 minutes late ask 3 minutes worth of questions, with the kind of patience you only get after surviving your own useless bureaucracy. When it was all done, the director of the clinic came down to the curb and offered a hand. He had the look of someone who had watched the video and thinking about donors. Mara shook the hand because not shaking it costs too much in the long war. She met his eyes and did not smile. That would have been the end in some gentler universe. But the war hadn't actually ended. Wars rarely do. They only go somewhere you're not looking. The quietus arrays were broken, but the silence had left seeds, subroutines that slithered in deep storage, shards of song that nested in old satellites, algorithms of absence that learned the shapes of human need and hunted those corridors. And far beyond the city, beyond even its sky, something listened to the little burst of noise as the array died. Something like an echo, but not. An old memory sharpened by absence. It turned its attention to the coordinates like a tide turns toward a shore a moon has whispered about for 1,000 years. The second attack didn't look like the first, because the enemy learns always. It came as a whisper back, a hush that traveled in the gap between signals, in the knot of messages, in the way a clock missing a tick teaches the next tick to be louder. Comms across the sector began to crackle and then smooth into a pearly quiet. Ships trying to light their drives coughed and went cold. Outposts went from chattering to pantomiming. The coalition called it a resurgence. The feeds called it a horror sequel. Veterans called it something else, predictable. Mara didn't wait for permission. She gathered people like a fire gathers a circle. The Ribathi tech, whose name was Ven, brought tools the weight of small promises. The Shillith twins brought a courage that trembled but did not fall. Keth brought himself, and that was enough. She used her old codes to call a man who owed her something and got them a transport that had seen better days but remembered them fondly. They lifted into a sky still tasting of the silence and set a course not away from the trouble, but toward it, because some people are built like that and call it simply living. The threat vector pointed to a dead moon named for a poet no one read anymore. It had a ring like a scar and 3 orbital stations like teeth in a broken jaw. The middle tooth flickered. That was where the whisper was thickest, where the absence pulsed like a heartbeat turned wrong. Mara throttled back to a glide and let the transport fall into a patient descending curve. The stars looked like they'd held their breath. They were waiting to see if this little ship would make noise or die quietly like everything else. "Patches on," Mara said. "If you don't have one, stay near someone who does. And if the world goes quiet in your head, focus on the simplest rhythm you trust. Breathing, the press of your boots against the deck, the beat of your own pulse. The silence can't steal what you know from the inside." Keth remembered with a clarity that was pain and power all at once, the first time he'd been told that. A human medic 20,000 light years and 1,000 lifetimes ago had crouched next to him in a trench that hummed like a tuning fork, and he had heard past the silence because she had taught him where to keep the sound, in his own bones. He met Mara's eyes across the small cockpit and nodded. She didn't know that story, but she recognized the look. The light you see in someone who's found a rope to hold. They docked like ghosts because the station's welcome was a dead thing. The air inside tasted like old anxiety and metal fatigue. The lights were the color of worry. Mara moved first because someone must. Keth moved second and made her path broad. Ven and the twins took the third rhythm and watched the edges the way dancers watch their mirrors. They found the whisper in the bones of the station's central spire. It was not a machine in the old sense. It was a network of knots, a lattice built from the spaces between things. Even naming it was hard, your mind slid off. That was the point. Silence weaponized. "It's learning," Ven said, fingers twitching without wanting to, as if his hands recognized a dark cousin of something they loved. "It's using what we want to say to kill saying." Keth felt the patches behind his plates hum in a way that said, "Hold on." He held. The corridor shook with a subtlety that scared because big shakes announce themselves and small ones insinuate. Somewhere far out, a ship lost its voice and in losing it lost itself. Mara placed her palm on the spire like she could feel guilt through metal. "We beat your parent," she said to it in a voice as soft as a threat. "We learned your edges. We mapped your hungers. We can beat your hungry little heart." She took from her pack a device that looked like a tuning fork that had been taught manners by a surgeon. Humans had built it with veiled math and Ribathi sensibility and Shillith intuition. It sang at a frequency that wasn't a sound but felt like one. She touched its tip to the spire. The spire recoiled. The station groaned like a ship in an older ocean. The lattice crackled with the static of refusing to break. That was when the enemy arrived in person. It didn't come as a fleet. Fleets make news. Fleets can be feared with charts and debated on feeds. It came as a single vessel with the arrogance of a knife. Its hull looked like the negative of color and absence that made your eyes water. It slid into the station's shadow and bit like a leech. Its boarding gangway bloomed like a mouth. Out walked soldiers in suits that hissed with vacuum and money. Their commander's helm was faceted. You couldn't see a face. That was deliberate. Faces make empathy by accident. Mara didn't posture. Keth didn't bellow. The twins set their shoulders so they wouldn't shake where anyone but each other could see it. Ven lofted a tool like a priest raises a relic. The commander spoke in a voice the suit had bought him. It sounded like power through a filter. "This installation is now property of the Quietus Syndicate under contract with parties you will not meet alive," he said. "Put down what you're holding and kneel." Keth touched the wall with his free hand. He is stone that has remembered moss, he reminded himself. He could be strong and soft both and choose which to be when. He angled his plate and caught the commander's reflection. It looked like a lie praying. Mara lifted the fork and held it between thumb and forefinger like a violinist taking pitch from the world. "No," she said, calm as a navigator reading a sky. He moved to shoot. Keth stepped. There is a moment in any fight when you can hear the gears of choice click. Humans hear it in their blood. Veiled feel it in their bones. He moved with the weight of decisions made before this day. He took the first shots on the plate. He angled his shoulder into the second. He accepted the bruise like a brother and threw the weapon out of the commander's line with a punch that was both a caress and a verdict. Mara tuned. The fork sang. It wasn't a sound in the air. It was a tone inside the silence. It found the negative space the lattice loved and made it ring until it became a positive, until it was filled, until the weapon that ate sound drowned in a flood it didn't understand. Ven slammed a patch against the spire that was, in every way that mattered, an apology written in physics. The twins held the corridor with their shimmering courage. The commander lunged. Keth met him with a movement old as rivers that had taught rocks the meaning of patience. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply made the space the commander wanted to occupy occupied by something else, responsibility. The suit's optics cracked. The commander stumbled, the first time perhaps in years that the world didn't rearrange for him. He hissed in his purchase of a voice. You don't know who, but Keth did know. He knew the type. A man who had never had to whisper easy, buddy to anyone. A man who had never been the hands that held. Keth pushed him back into his own empty noise. Mara's fork reached the point the math had promised but had never guaranteed. The lattice shuddered and then, like an animal surprised to find itself cornered, lashed out. The station screamed in a frequency that was not audible, and Keth felt his patches strain. The twins pressed their palms to their own ears, uselessly but out of instinct that was love for their own minds. Ven grinned like someone who just solved a hard problem and hated that the solution looked this much like a crime. The lattice broke, not with drama again, but with a cessation, the way a headache ends and only then do you realize you have been living inside one for days. The station's ribs clicked in relief. The whisper peeled back like a veil in a badly written play, and the stars, oh, the stars, returned. They weren't louder. They had never been noise, but their presence flooded back. The tiny variations in cosmic background that tell you the universe remembers its first fire. The sizzle of solar wind on the skin of a ship. The distant chatter of civilization making the night a little less alone. The commander staggered. The soldiers in suits that had bought them borrowed courage went from aggressive to calculating. Calculating men and women often choose to live. They backed away in a choreography that acted like control. The commander pointed at the device in Mara's hand and spoke an oath the silence didn't catch. His ship unbit the station. It slid out with the oily promise of a sequel. Mara sagged. Keth caught her elbow and said it again because rituals work. Easy, buddy. She smiled without needing to. I like when humans steal your words and make them ours, she said. He shook his head, amused. We stole yours, he said. We just say them with an accent. They returned to the transport with the world not quiet but right. The stars hummed like a choir that had forgiven the conductor. The house back on the planet had soup on and the vent still blew warm. The city had filmed itself being saved and would argue about it for days, and none of that mattered as much as the fact that the twins could sleep without flinching when a door closed. For a while, it was enough. Then the universe knocked a third time, not with the aim of a pirate or the malice of a syndicate, but with the focused hunger of the thing that had begun the war. An echo returning to a canyon it loved, a virus remembering a body, a chorus building to a verse it had never gotten to sing. The feeds called the event the silent convergence. The old soldiers just said, "It's back like weather." It came as a tide from the dark between arms of the galaxy, a wave of absence riding the line where physics thins and something else starts to hum. It washed across beacons and black boxes, across stations and planets. The coalition lit up like a map of panic. Mara and Keth didn't wait for orders that would fall quiet in transit. They held hands on a deck that smelled like coffee and metal and plotted a course that would take them to the place where the wave would crest. A dead star, or rather, a star in hospice. It had burned its best and now sagged in its own gravity, muttering neutrinos to itself, making murmurs mathematicians love. Around it drifted the bones of a war, hulls without owners and suits without names. This was where the silent convergence wanted to make a new nest. Dead things are easy to turn into tools. They came with more than a small team this time. The coalition was not blind to heroes, and sometimes it does the smart thing. It asks them to lead. Mara didn't want the title. She took it anyway because if someone has to decide when good people go into the dark, better it be someone who had slept under a cheap vent with broken souls and learned the weight of an hour. Keth didn't want renown. He carried it anyway because it sat on him like armor he could set aside when the fight was done. The fleet that formed was a mosaic. Human transports, veiled boulder ships that carried starlight like it was quarry, shillith skippers that turned space like silk Ribathi longboats that navigated equations the way sailors had once watched gulls. They came in from vectors that made the least sense to the enemy's predictive algorithms. They came quiet and bright at once. The convergence rose like a wall. It wasn't a thing but the absence of things, shaped by intent. The stars' murmur flattened, as if an old man had been asked to be dignified at his own wake. The bones of ships drifted with an eerie grace toward a point that wasn't there until you noticed that it was. Mara took the deck microphone and, knowing she didn't need it for sound but for ritual, spoke soft enough that only her team heard and loud enough that the universe might get the message. "We aren't going to beat it with louder noise," she said. "We are going to beat it with attention, with the small and the steady, with being enough consistently until its hunger gets bored. That is not a speech that ends up on memorials. It is, nonetheless, how you win long wars." They put their ship where the line would break first. They tuned the device the coalition had improved from Mara's fork into a choir of forks, a scaffold of tone. They asked the veiled to become a wall again, and the veiled did, because that is what their bones like to do when asked by someone who has looked them in the eye before and meant please. The convergence hit. Everything went pale. Blood remembered it was salt water. Memory became glass and then fog and then something you love and only recall as a shape at noon when you are tired. Keth felt the patches behind his plates become small. He felt his breath become a choice he had to make. He made it. Mara's hands shook once. She set them on the console and made them still. She counted herself in like she had counted Keth in under the rain by the clinic door. In, 2, 1. She breathed. Her breath made a rhythm. The device read the rhythm. The fleet learned it. Thousands of souls repeated it. The convergence met a wall not of force but of stubborn humanity and its friends. There was still violence. There are always those who think a problem cannot be solved unless something breaks in a way you can film. Some ships fired and the shots chewed at edges. But it was the choir, soft, constant, unsexy, that did the work. The convergence aped itself trying to find a frequency humans couldn't breathe at. Humans breathed anyway. The veiled set their plates against the storm. The shillith twined their small ships like thread and made knots in the wave. The Ribathi wrote codes in the way the last neutrinos leaked from the dying star and told the wave that this was not a place to nest. The hospice already had a patient and his family was here. Hours. It took hours. It took lives. Because nothing worth having is free at this scale. It took Mara's voice until it was a whisper. It took Keth's muscles until they trembled and he told them to pretend they were mountains. It took the twins' courage until it broke and they held each other and found there was another layer underneath. It took Ven's genius until he became dumb with fatigue and his fingers still found the right wire. And then, like a stubborn child who had been told no and finally considered that the word might be a form of love, the convergence lost interest. It peeled away to find a place without such inconvenient people. It sighed out across the dead star's shoulder and went to sulk in the dark beyond charts. The fleet did not cheer wildly. Not right away. They were too tired and too aware of the cost. They sat in their chairs and leaned on their rails and wiped at eyes that had collected star salt. They listened to the small noises of a ship that had done its job and would like to sleep. Mara found Keth in the corridor outside the med bay where the wall had heartfelt dents. She leaned her head against his shoulder the way one tree leans into another after a storm. He placed a plate-sized hand on her back and remembered that whispered ritual one more time. He didn't say it, not this time. He let the silence be a good thing, owned by them and not by a weapon. Then the feeds wanted news. They always do. They called Mara a hero and Keth a symbol and the twins a miracle and Ven a genius, and they weren't lying, but they weren't telling the truth that mattered most. A human and a veiled had treated each other like people when the world was rotten, and that had turned the axis of the day just enough so the night slid off. The city with neon bones and glass skin put up a new mural where the rain made rivers down the faces of monuments. It showed an alien holding a plate like a shield and a human holding a tuning fork like a scalpel, and the two of them eye to eye and neither trying to make the other less. People took pictures. They made it their backdrop for a week. Then something else new happened and the feeds moved on. But the mural stayed, and sometimes someone would stand in front of it and stand up a little straighter. Mara went back to the house with the honest floors. The soup tasted like a victory that hadn't made itself gross with self-regard. Keth slept under the warm vent and dreamed of a hillside on a world with gravity heavier than this one, where plants grew stubborn, and the rain carved its way between stones that had decided never to move. In the dream, a human walked up the hill and didn't tell the stones to be other than what they were. She sat, and the two of them watched the sky grow silent and then remember itself. It was a good dream. When he woke, the patch behind his ear had a little green light that meant, "This part is done. You can take me off." He peeled it and felt the breath of the room, a hush that was a friend, not the enemy, and smiled with the slow wideness of someone who had learned to smile by watching how humans do it. Mara came in with 2 mugs and a look that said she'd made them not because she wanted coffee, but because mugs are good to hold when you don't know where to put your hands after the universe asks you to relax. She handed him one. He took it with the reverence of a soldier learning civilian grace. "What now?" he asked. She shrugged and looked at the window where the city was busy being itself again. "We keep the roof patched," she said. "We answer the door when it knocks. We teach people to breathe when the world forgets music. We hold hands. We point at the stars and tell them they can't scare us with their silence. We build small things that add up." He nodded. It was a plan that had saved more lives than any campaign he'd ever been drafted into. A week later, the clinic printed new posters. They read, "All species served. All service respected." The triage tech who had recited the wrong script on the day Keth fell under the rain now recited the right one with a sincerity you only get by being ashamed properly first. The security drone above the door had a new optic with more empathy in its algorithm. That was someone's work too. That mattered. And far away on the edge of maps, the quietest syndicate sharpened new contracts and told their buyers the war was not over. They were right, but they were wrong about who would believe them. Because the story had gone out. An alien vet denied treatment had been welcomed in by a human who whispered, "Easy, buddy," and a door had opened and then a bigger door and then a door so large it reshaped a tide. Because the war of silent stars wasn't just lasers and arrays. It was who holds whom when the night crushes in. It was what kind of hush you build, a weapons or a rooms. It was the difference between a quiet enforced with fear and a quiet wrapped around trust. Years later, they still told this story. They told it with the names because the names mattered. They said Mara Hale with respect that tasted like strong tea. They said Keth with a warmth that made vowels feel like hands. They said Ven and the twins and the way the fleet had breathed all together like a single chest. They said the dead star's name again, and this time people read the poet whose name it wore. That was another kind of victory, not loud but deep. On some nights, the city's neon bones glowed softer. The rain ran down the mural and made it look like the figures were moving. People in the know said that was ridiculous. People with better hearts said, SHH. Listen. In a clinic where real plants now grew, a human med intern once caught a Rabathi elder when her knees gave. He whispered, because the best rituals spread like home cooking. Easy, buddy. In the house with honest floors, the twins bought better soup pots and laughed loud enough to prove the silence had never owned their throats. In a veiled village where the hills refused to be other than hills, a child listened to the story and stopped being afraid of the dark. Mara and Keth didn't become gods. They became neighbors. When the quietus came back in small bites, they chewed it the way you chew gristle you don't want but must. When someone new arrived at the house with eyes that had seen the inside of a weaponized hush, Mara would take their hands. She'd set a patch. She'd say the line. Keth would stand in the doorway like a door of a different kind, the kind that says, "No bad thing passed here." The War of Silent Stars didn't end with a parade. It ended each time with a room where the right quiet was kept. It ended with a handful of breaths and a whisper that told unruly hearts they could calm down. It ended with two people looking at each other instead of through. It ended with the stars, those unblinking teachers, learning something from the stubbornest little species that ever learned to wrap noise around love. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.